Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Let's Talk About Prevention. If you've been joining us, we're glad that you have decided to come back for today's webinar. We're super excited about it. If this is your first webinar that you've attended in the series, let me introduce myself. I am Stacy Pendarvis. I'm the Vice President of Programs at the Monique Burr Foundation for Children, also known as MBF. And our mission is simply to provide the best comprehensive evidence-based prevention to children and teens that we can. We have multiple school-based programs, some extracurricular programs, and our programs cover bullying, cyberbullying, all 4 types of child abuse and digital safety, as well as some other things in the upper grades. And we have reached over 3.5 million students since our program started in 2010. We're now in 24 states and 3 countries, different schools and child advocacy centers using our programs. And one of the things that we love is collaboration with other organizations, and the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children does a great job of teaching about online safety and online exploitation. So we love to promote them and their resources. And we're super excited today to have Susan Kennedy from the National Center here with us to help educate and empower all of us. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. I know some people are still joining us, but let me introduce you to our speaker. Susan Kennedy joined the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, also known as NCMEC, in 2018. As the Prevention Program Manager, Susan is responsible for driving the implementation of NCMEC's prevention education programs in line with current trends and best practices in the fields of child development and child protection. In this position, Susan also works with nonprofit organizations, law enforcement groups, victim service providers, and other local and national stakeholders in the child protection field to develop and cultivate partnerships to further distribute and disseminate prevention education. Prior to working at NCMEC, Susan worked for 9.5 years at the Center for Alexandria's Children in Alexandria, Virginia, as the Director of Programs. In that role, Susan conducted several hundred child forensic interviews, coordinated the Child Advocacy Center program, and oversaw the development of a primary community-based prevention program for young children and families. She has also been very fortunate to work and volunteer in a variety of other early childhood prevention, intervention, and education programs. Susan holds a Bachelor of Science degree in psychology from the College of William and Mary and a Master of Education degree in human development and psychology from Harvard University. And if you joined us last week, as with the information that Richard Gary of IROC2 shared, NCMEC has phenomenal resources and does a great job of educating youth about online safety. We are proud to include their messaging in our programs and share NCMEC as a go-to resource with youth educators and parents. And we're so fortunate to have her here today. So Susan, I will now turn it over to you to get started with our presentation. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. You've taken some of the things that I needed to work in off my first slide. So that's always great. Let me go ahead and pull up my PowerPoint and kick Stacy off. So give me just a minute. But like I said, thank you for that great introduction. And I'm really excited to be here and glad that you guys invited me to talk about online exploitation. I know many of us are thinking and worrying and wondering about what this current and probably future for a while environment of kids being online more and schools being online means for children. So we're going to talk about that a little bit, sprinkle that in, but really what we're going to focus on today is online exploitation and kind of give a primer and a little bit of information about the National Center and what we know about online exploitation and what happens to kids when they're online, and a little bit about prevention of that as well. So I do want, before I launch into this, I just want to give a heads up to those who are watching that today we're going to talk about child sexual exploitation online. We're going to be talking about child sexual abuse. And so these topics are difficult to talk about. And I just want to remind people that this is recorded. So if today, Thursday afternoon, is not the hour you want to spend thinking and talking about these issues, that's fine. Feel free to take breaks. Feel free to turn it off and watch the recorded one on a different day. It's really important that we take care of ourselves so that we can take care of the children and families we're trying to serve and help, and our own families as well. I know many of those of you who are joining are school counselors, our Children's Advocacy Center staff, our social workers. So just in general, I always like to plug and make sure that we are all aware of vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue in this work. and that if you are not aware of those terms or resources available to you, please reach out, or even to me or the Monique Burr Foundation. We can point you in the direction of some resources. So I always like to make that disclaimer, because I don't have any visual depictions or graphic or written descriptions of child exploitation in this presentation, but we are going to talk directly and descriptively about some of those things. So I want to make sure everyone's aware of that before we continue. As Stacy said, I work at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. I'm involved in the prevention programs as well as the outreach and training that we do. If you're not familiar with the National Center, we are about 35 years old now, started in the, oh, I just turned your thing off, I'm sorry. Started in the 1980s as a nonprofit founded by John and Reve Walsh, unfortunately in a reaction to the kidnapping of their son Ed.M, who was later murdered. And at that time, the Walshes and several other families who had experienced a missing child incident came together and started this grassroots organization to address missing children. And we are still a non-governmental, nonprofit organization. Congress does have about 15 things that we are mandated to do by the government, but we are a nonprofit, and we're able to go above and beyond those mandates to provide other programming thanks to public-private partnerships. This is our beautiful office that I have not seen since March, but it is outside of DC in Alexandria, Virginia. So our mission is threefold: find missing children, reduce sexual exploitation, and prevent future victimization. And we have at the bottom there, hope is why we're here. We use that as a driving force and a driving mantra for everything we do, hoping that all children return home, that children can heal from sexual exploitation, and that they will be given the resources and protection they need to do so. And then, as we're going to talk about today, that we can actually put ourselves out of business, and many of you out of work in your current roles, because we hope that we can end child abuse and child sexual exploitation and incidents that cause children to go missing. So I'm going to run through this briefly. I want to say, especially if you are if you're a child serving professional, particularly if you work at a children's advocacy center or in law enforcement or social work, if you are not aware of our operational resources, I'm not going to talk very much about them today. You can learn more at our website, missingkids.org. And for this audience, I also want to let you know that when we're talking about missing children, 90% of the time we're talking about children who run away from home. So our services are very relevant for many child protective services workers who may not know about them. So explore that, reach out to me if you need more information. But just briefly, many are familiar with our missing children's posters that, in the old days were on milk cartons or newspapers, and now are online and social media. We also act as a secondary distribution network for Amber Alerts. When there's an urgent alert that needs to go out. And we provide lots of operational support and resources for law enforcement as well, in particular. And then also with both, I'm going to talk about child exploitation a lot in this presentation, but with both for missing kids and kids who've been victims of child sexual exploitation, we also have services for families, specialized peer support, professional support, and linkages to resources that you can link families to directly or avail yourselves of to find resources and support for those families as well. But our mission to reduce child sexual exploitation, along with the missing posters, we have a hotline, 1-800-THE-LOST, that operates 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. You can make a report of child exploitation over the phone to that tip line. You can also use our online platform called the Cyber Tip Line, which we're going to be talking a lot about. And the Cyber Tip Line is one of those mandated services by Congress. It is a clearinghouse and a way for us to collect information about child sexual exploitation online and provide information and analytical support back to law enforcement who are investigating those cases. And we're going to talk a lot more about the Cyber Tip Line in a few minutes. We also have a lot of services to help children get, or families of children get explicit content off of the internet. We're going to focus on that as well. And again, as I said, we have family support for those cases as well. And then my favorite part of the mission, because I am the prevention program manager, is preventing future victimization. So basically, the National Center, as this clearinghouse for both missing and exploited children, we gather a lot of information about what's happening to kids right now, and the dangers and the victimization and the trends. And what we want to do is give that information away, give it to local communities so that you all can integrate it into your prevention programs and really have an understanding of what's going on with kids, so that we can all use that information and work together to prevent children from being victimized in the first place. Obviously, best outcome. So I want to kick off right now with a poll that I think Corey is going to pop up for me, really to get an idea of your level right now of comfort and awareness of child exploitation is. If you have questions for me, throw them up there. We'll try to get them at the end. And also use the chat box. But for this question specifically, okay, you guys are great. So these are coming in. We'll turn off in a minute, but we've got almost 200 of you responding already. It looks like most people are coming. It's going back and forth between somewhat familiar and very familiar, which is great. So, and looks like somewhat familiar is winning right now with 100 responses. So that's great. So a little bit of awareness. I think you'll find as we talk through this that you're probably more familiar than you think, but that's helpful for me to know as we're moving through. And good, not very many of you are very familiar, so that lowers my anxiety level about talking with you all. Kidding. Okay, so moving right along. So most people said something familiar. So I want to back up and talk a minute about the cyber tip line. As I said, you can also call 1-800-THE-LOST, but there is an online platform. This is something that Congress asked us to do. And in the box, the gray box there, you can see kind of the technical definitions of what child exploitation we're talking about when we're talking about what is reported to cyber tip line. The next thing that I want to do actually is play a short video for you all about the cyber tip line that gives a really clear example of the cyber tip line's role in protecting kids and responding to child sexual exploitation. Again, last warning I'm going to give, but this is a description of a case that we had, an acute case that involved the sexual abuse of an infant. There's nothing graphic about it, but I just want to let you know that that's the subject matter. So again, this is not something you want in your life on a Thursday afternoon. It's 2 minutes. This would be a good time to go get a drink or walk away for a second, but it is a really powerful and clear example of what the cyber tip line does. And so I want to share it with you all. So hopefully.
Hey, Susan, we're not hearing audio on the video and it's kind of lagging.
I think it might be because you have your earbuds plugged in.
Oh.
All right, let me try that.
Sorry, everybody. We'll figure it out.
Let me restart it, and you guys tell me if this is better.
Okay.
On any given day,
Yes.
working
Good.
the cyber
Perfect.
tip
Thank
line
you.
at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children.
Shoot.
Sort through thousands of reports. That's tens of thousands of images and videos of suspected child sexual abuse flooding in every day from electronic service providers like Google, Microsoft, Facebook, and more. NCMEC is the critical hub, quickly getting these reports in the hands of law enforcement. In mid-December of last year, one report quickly rose to top priority. A NCMEC analyst identified brand new content, photos and videos of an infant being sexually exploited by an unknown male. NCMEC knew that brand new files meant one thing: the child was in imminent danger. Working fast, NCMEC tracked an IP address in the report to a possible location in San Jose, California. And within 3 hours, cops had located the 5-month-old infant, arrested the suspect, and rescued 11 other children from the home. Saving children from these horrific situations happens because of the partnerships among NCMEC, law enforcement, and the tech industry through the cyber tip line. A strong, modernized cyber tip line enables us to continue the fight together to rescue children and bring offenders to justice.
Okay. I'm gonna get plugged back in here. Okay. So that was hopefully a little quick, clear overview of what the cyber tip line does, responding to those reports and helping get law enforcement information that they need, especially when they need to respond to new information, a new case like that. These, what you have in front of you now, are some information about the cyber tip line data. You can see, in 2018, there was a huge bump up in terms of the number of reports we received on the cyber tip line, more than 18 million. In 2019, we saw that number go down a little bit, but I would say some, probably not all, but some of that decrease is because of some work we've done with the tech industry to get those reports a little bit more efficient and be able to put you know, multiple images or multiple things together with, because if it was one offender or something like that. So some of that is, some of that dip down is because of efficiency gained in terms of how those reports come in. But 16 million is still a lot. And we actually, even though we saw fewer reports in 2019, we saw more images. So the number of images actually went up even though the reports went down. Whoa, somebody's here not muted. I can mute you, okay. And I know many people are interested too in kind of what do our numbers look like under COVID right now. And if you go to our website, there's a recent blog that we did that shows we actually have seen an increase the first 6 months of 2020. We've seen a 90% increase in the number of cyber tip line reports coming in and a 93% increase in the number of online enticement reports. And we'll talk about online enticement a little later. So we are seeing almost a doubling in the first half of 2020, which is certainly concerning. And we'll continue to watch that as far as the data trend. This is just a little bit of background. You know, you heard electronic service providers, we shorten that to ESP. And just let you guys know, I mean, one reason you're seeing all these reports is that ESPs are required to look for and find and send us images that they become aware of. And then in addition to that, many ESPs go above and beyond what they're required by law and work with us on voluntary initiatives to look for more material and figure out how to get this stuff down and not circulating. So we have over 1,400 companies that are registered with us to make these reports. So it's a huge team effort and a lot of information and a lot of data coming in and a lot of work, frankly, from Nick and the tech companies to find this content and try the best to take it down or not have it up and not have it circulating. And then the other half of kind of what we do for exploited children's cases is very early on when we started the cyber tip line back in 2002, we realized that there was really a need to figure out when we're seeing an image more than once, we need to be able to pull that together and know we've already seen this child, we know who he or she is, we can let law enforcement know that this child's been identified, we can kind of keep track. And like the video said, if it's new, we know that that needs to be escalated as a higher priority. If it's an image that we know has been around for 10 years, we know who this child is, we know where they are, we know that they're safe. There's still things that need to be done about that image as far as notifying the victim and other, you know, law enforcement things that may need to be done, but that kid is safe or we know who she is. And so the Child Victim Identification Program was really formed to help kind of organize that information and understand, you know, who are the kids that we've seen already, we know who they are, how can we link that information together with what's coming in today, and then who are the kids who are waiting to be identified. And one of the things we ask law enforcement to do is to always send us imagery that they find in their cases, because a new image that we can connect with a different one might help us have additional information to be able to identify a child that we haven't been able to identify. So this child identification program, you can see some stats here. These are very recent. This is through last week. Over 19,000 children that we know of have been identified. So these are images that we see. Some of these series and these images our analysts have seen thousands of times. Some of them they see every day. Some of them are very actively circulated. But we also have over 71,000 kids who are depicted in images and we don't know who they are. And we're waiting to figure out if we can get more information or if we'll be able to figure out who they are. And then to date, since the history of the Child Victim Identification Program, we've run more than 314 million images through our system. So that's a little bit about the CVIT program. My slide wants to stay here. I'm not sure why. Okay. So I'm just gonna pause there for a second. That's a little bit of background of why NCMEC knows what we know and kind of how we're serving as this national clearinghouse and what we're talking about. There are two kind of big frames of reference that I want to put around any conversation about child exploitation online. The first is that child sexual exploitation online is child sexual abuse. It is child sexual abuse that is facilitated by technology or facilitated by the internet. So those of you who work in the child abuse field, we want to make sure we're not thinking of this as like a totally separate thing. This is child sexual abuse facilitated by technology. So everything that you know about what makes kids vulnerable, about the things we can do to promote protective factors, about the things we need to do in our communities to protect kids from child sexual abuse, that all applies to protecting them from child sexual exploitation. And this is probably a whole different webinar we could go into about the connections between online and real world and sexual abuse and offenders and all that, which I'm not gonna have time to do today. But just to say, I wanna put this umbrella around this conversation and say that everything I'm gonna talk about online exploitation is child sexual abuse. So everything we know and do about that applies. The second frame is that a lot of times when we do these webinars, the question that parents, and those of you talking in communities about online safety know this, parents want to know, what's the top threat? What's the worst thing? What's the app I need to make sure that they've never downloaded? What's the behavior I need to never let them do? You know, what's the game I don't want to let them play, and then they'll be safe online. And, you know, the answer is that, the answer to that question is, you know, a good news, bad news scenario. The good news is you don't have to spend your time learning every little thing and going back and getting a computer software engineering degree to keep your kids safe online, and just being a total expert and figuring out what's the worst app and what's the one I need to get off their phone. So that could be kind of good news. The bad news is any platform for technology can facilitate child sexual abuse. And that's absolutely what we see on the cyber tip line. Any platform that allows for communication between two people is an opportunity for a child to be sexually abused. So it's not about finding the bad technology. Technology is not all bad. We're using technology right now in a way to provide education and share information. So technology is not bad in and of itself. What we want to think about is behavior and vulnerabilities and risk and protective factors, again, the same way we do about child sexual abuse. So that's kind of, I mean, good news, bad news, maybe more work, but again, everything we're doing to build relationships, to build critical thinking skills, to build protective factors applies to online life. It's not a totally separate thing. I would say though, the way I want to think about the top threat to kids online is this idea of access. The reason technology and the internet makes kids vulnerable is because of access. And I have two ways of talking about that. One is to say that the internet provides direct and private access to our children. So those of you, you know, my work in my previous life, I was a authorized facilitator of stewards of children. I know probably many of you on the phone are as well. Thinking about observable and interruptible situations. Well, the internet can pretty easily provide lots of situations that are not observable or uninterruptible. They're right on their phone, you know, and they're offsite and you don't know what they're doing, and the communication is totally private. So that's what creates vulnerability, is that direct private access. When it's very hard to have visibility into that and observe it, right? And so when we think about prevention strategies, we're thinking about how do we mitigate that? How do we provide interruption, observability? How do we talk to our kids about what red flags to notice when that behavior is going on, right? So how to, in the same way, again, the same way we're thinking about it in real life. The other side of access that, you know, I'm increasingly thinking about is it also provides instantaneous and easy access to the world. And that includes consumers of explicit material of children. So the ability to, at a moment, share with anyone you want, and that's going to, you know, and that could include people who are consuming explicit material or sexualizing imagery of children, or being able to find children who might be vulnerable to exploitation. That sharing out and that access to everyone and that public access and the way that is instantaneous and easy to do. That's another way that kids are vulnerable via access. So when we think about top threats, let's think about why the internet, why technology makes kids vulnerable, and let's think about access. And so our prevention strategies and our thinking around that should be thinking about how do we mitigate that? How do we make that safer, that reality of that access safer? Okay, so I have another poll question, because what I want to do is, in the time we have left, go into kind of the types of child exploitation. So that's what the next poll is about. I want to ask you guys what topics, what kinds of child sexual exploitation are you most interested in talking about today? So you should be seeing, and again, feel free, I'm blowing through a lot of material. So, you know, even while you're waiting this, throw some questions in the QA box, throw them up in the chat, and we're going to try to get to those at the end, because I know I'm giving out a lot of information. These numbers are flying. Online enticement looks like it's winning right now. It's interesting. Okay, so I'm gonna wait. About 62 people have voted. I'll give you a little bit more time to get your votes in. Still looks like online enticement, sextortion are up there. Okay. Oh. Okay, so I think you guys can see the results. So online enticement got about 2/3 of the vote, but also talking about child sexual abuse material and sextortion as well. I thought sexting would be higher. I'm not gonna lie. A lot of people really are interested in what we should be doing about sexting. So, but also up there with 25%. So, okay. So I'm gonna cover all of those things. I will try to slow down and talk a little bit more about online enticement since we're interested in that, but interest in everything. Okay. So I'm gonna close that, move on, maybe. Okay. So here's just the list, the first 4 ones I'm gonna talk about. Child sexual abuse material. This is what we used to call child pornography. We are trying very hard to move away from child pornography, because what these images are is they are documentation of the sexual abuse of a child. They are not an activity that the child is consensually taking place in. They are not, it's not pornography. It is the documentation of a crime, and the crime is the sexual assault of a child. And so that's what we've started calling this imagery. You might see CSAM abbreviated or CSAI abbreviated. And we're gonna dig into the stats a little bit, but what I wanna say about this is the vast majority of what we see in the cyber tip line is child sexual abuse material. And again, we'll get into the data on this, but most of this child sexual abuse material is created by people who know the child, and a lot of it's created in their homes. So for those of you who do, what we're talking about is we're talking about images and documentation of the sex abuse cases that you see all the time. And again, the dynamics, and if we're gonna stop having child sexual abuse material circulating on the internet, we have to stop child sexual abuse. And that's the majority of what we see and what we see happening to kids. And we'll dig into the data on that in a few minutes. Online enticement. So a lot of people said they're interested in this. Online enticement is a broad category of things that includes an adult trying to get the child to do something sexual, would be kind of a layman's definition of it. It could be they want the child to engage in sexual conversation. It could be they want the child to send or create some kind of images or participate in a live stream, something like that. It could be in some cases that they want the child to leave their home, and then once they've left their home, then a hands-on sexual assault occurs. Those are kind of variations of it. Online enticement also includes this crime of sextortion that I know several people were interested in. That's a basic definition of online enticement. Again, we'll dig into the data in a little bit. It is important for people to know. Data is hard to come by on online enticement, but it's not all strangers. And so when we talk to kids about online enticement, you know, certainly for young kids in particular, telling them, you know, having really tight privacy settings, not talking to people they don't know in real life is really important. But just with child sexual abuse, we need to go beyond that and talk about behaviors that are not okay and not allowed and things to be aware of, even if it's someone you know, even if this is someone you met at church, even if this is someone you know from your school, even this, you know, this enticing or convincing or making you do these things is not okay no matter who it is. We need to bring that language from the child sexual abuse field into the online exploitation field. And that's even true of online enticement, even though we don't think of it that way. Sextortion is a combination of the word sex and extortion. And it's typically, offenders trying to get kids to create additional explicit content. So usually it's when an offender has, say, a nude or partially nude image or some kind of explicit material of a child, and they want them to create more of it. But it could also be they want them to meet up in person, or they want them to do something else. But they're forcing or threatening them to do something based on the fact that they have this imagery, and they're threatening to distribute it more. Again, as with online enticement, it's important to note that, you know, some of the research says as much as 60% of the time, the offender in a sextortion case is someone the child knows. In teenagers, a very common case type is actually romantic partners who are no longer romantic partners, and one person is not happy about that. And there may be imagery that was created even in the course of a relationship consensually. And now they're saying, hey, I have these pictures and I'm gonna send them to your family and your whole school unless we get back together, or unless you do X, Y, or unless you create more images. So that's a case dynamic. Again, we're thinking about sextortion. We often tend to default to the stranger on the internet getting the child to create pictures and then threatening for more, which does happen. But we need to remember when we're talking to our kids that that's not the only way it happens, and that it can happen with someone you know and trust, just as we do with our child sexual abuse prevention messaging. Lastly, child sex trafficking. I know many people are aware of this. Some child sex trafficking is facilitated by the internet. No, certainly not all of it. There's certainly child sex trafficking that occurs in communities, and there's intrafamilial trafficking, which may have nothing to do with the internet, but the internet is a common way to recruit both victims, find victims, and recruit buyers. And in the pandemic, NCMEC has seen some increase in using the internet and using paid live streams as an example of a way that this kind of victimization is shifting, you know, in this environment where people don't want to meet up in person, and that's not a safe or inconspicuous thing to do. So we have seen that's always been a part of victimization for some victims of child sex trafficking. It's not a totally new thing, but it is something we see more of. Okay, now I want to talk about kind of a few things that are under the umbrella of, I'm open for a better name, by the way, if anyone on the phone call wants to talk more about this. Self-produced explicit content is pretty wonky. And I don't think it's very clear, but what it means is that whatever the explicit content, the nude, the partially nude, even you know, sexual behaviors that are filmed in a video or live stream is produced by the child on their own. And there are a myriad of different dynamics and contexts in which that occurs. But there's this bucket of exploitation where the child is creating the content. I have in the middle there sexting. That was one of the things on the poll. We talk about that a lot with older kids. It is a totally different, longer probably webinar about what we should do about sexting, what we think about it, and what we should tell kids about it, and what's effective. But that is a form of self-produced content. That's generally thought of when consensual, romantic partners are sending nude or partially nude or explicit content back and forth. And because they're minors, of course, that is child sexual abuse material and explicit content. But we also at NCMEC see all ages of kids creating self-produced content. You'll see younger kids posting things on social media or via live streams that are either, and you see a variety of things. You see normative behavior that's sort of in the exploration, I'll show you mine, you show me yours kind of stuff, but because it's filmed and posted online, it becomes extremely problematic and exploitive that way because of the people who see it. We see kids who are told and manipulated even to produce this content, via the comments, like do that. I'm totally making up, these are not real examples, but just, being told to, remove clothing or do something sexual, and they're kind of being groomed and told to do that in comments via the internet. And we see some content that is expressly, kids saying that they're talking about sex in this video and they're going to show you their sex parts, and just, I'm totally making those up, but those are examples of the kinds of things we see even at young ages. So this self-produced content happens at all ages. It can be images, videos, or as I've alluded to, it can also be live streams. And again, as those are embedded in more and more platforms and are easy to do, we have to think about that because live streams present a kind of unique challenge in terms of trying to moderate the content, right? Like I'm on a live stream right now. What I said, you've seen it, you might have recorded it, it's out there. So we have very little mechanisms for moderating it, which is really challenging, but those can certainly be received by people who are exploiting the child, but also recorded and redistributed as well. And sometimes, that's not obvious that could happen or is happening. So those have the potential to be really exploitive. And then I put enticement and sextortion in a box because I think whenever you're talking about self-produced content, you need to realize some of it, even though it seemingly is self-produced and totally self-generated, there's always the chance that there's an enticement or sextortion piece of it that you don't know. And self-produced content is produced in the context of a child being enticed or sextorted. And sometimes that can be hard to tell at the outset. And certainly the self-produced content is a big part of enticement and sextortion cases often. So that's self-produced explicit content. I'm going to dive back into the data again, and I'm really going to blow through this because I do want to end in about 10 minutes. So we have time for questions, 10, 15 minutes. So I would invite, as I did before, if there's any of this that you want more information about, you'll have an email address at the end, and also our website has like all of this data and lots of reports are available on our website. But this is a breakdown of the 2019 cyber tip line reports. And I just would note, as I did earlier, that the vast majority of it is child sexual abuse material. That's partially a reflection of the fact that that's what people are required to report to us. That is something that's relatively easy because of all the work that tech partners and NCMEC and others and law enforcement have done to figure out and identify these images, and these lots of the known images that we talked about in our CVIP program have unique identifiers, and it's relatively easy to comb and look and pull those down and report those. And that is what everyone is required to report. It is harder to understand and to detect online enticement. Because again, as those of you who have experience in child protection would appreciate, a lot of the communication between an offender and a child is going to be innocuous rapport building conversation. And how do you tease apart when something is online enticement? It's not impossible. We have 19,000 reports of it, but it is harder to detect than images. And same thing with child sex trafficking. We know in the field child sex trafficking can also be really hard to identify. And so those things are harder to find, but they're still found often, and you can see those numbers here. But I do think this also, I just want to reiterate for this audience, we know 1 in 10 children are sexually abused. They're often abused by people they know and trust. And so when we think about the greatest dangers to our kids and where we need to spend our time, I think this really reinforces that what's happening to kids is they're being sexually abused. And that's what we're seeing online as well. So this is a breakdown just of the images in our child victim identification program. And this is all the images we get there, and you can kind of see the breakdown. And what I wanted to pull out from this chart is that about 50% of the time, according to our data in terms of what's reported to us when it comes in the cyber tip line, about 50% of the time it's someone the kid knows. So again, I think we tend to think about online safety, and we tend to think about it with a stranger danger lens. And I think the data just doesn't support that. So we know that a lot of times kids are harmed by people they know. So we need to weave in that messaging we know is best practice for child sexual abuse. We need to make sure we're carrying over and blending and including that with our online safety messages as well. And thinking again about online exploitation as child sexual abuse. So all the things we do in our community to keep kids safe from child sexual abuse, that will help keep them from having exploitive imagery online. But I do want to talk just before we leave, because I know I'm running short on time, but about actively traded images. So we take those images we see in the CVIT program, and when we've seen it at least 5 times, we call it an actively traded image, because to us that means there's some circulation going on with this image. And right, that's kind of that's the thing you really want to avoid. You know, if you have explicit imagery, so you don't want it widely circulating and lots of people seeing it. Obviously, that's very harmful and traumatizing for children. And so we have this actively traded group of images. I'm going to talk about the data on those in a second. We can see them at least 5 times. I would note some of these images we see thousands and thousands of times. Some of these are in very active circulation, and we just see it thousands and thousands of times. Oh, they did 1 minute this. So this is some data on our actively traded, and you know, you can see here it's only 11% of what's in our CVIT program, but again, some of this is very heavily circulated, and we have victims whose images have been circulating for more than a decade, and they're coming in, and almost every day, you know, if not every day, we're getting reports of someone else looking at it, and so that's a real trauma and a really unique trauma that these victims deal with. But you can see on the side who these victims are. They're mostly female from what we have in our program. And I would note that, you know, 69% are prepubescent or younger, or infant toddlers. And so again, I think kind of the public perception and what we tend to think about this imagery is that they are sexting and teenagers and they're partially nude photos. And I'm sparing you some of the more graphic details of what these images are, and they're egregious. And they're more often than not depicting young kids. Again, for those of you who do child sexual abuse work, this is probably makes total sense, because we know the median age of child sexual abuse is only 8. And that's not something the general public knows, but this imagery of young kids is what is in demand and what is most likely actively traded. And that's what we see in our data. This is a slide that pulls out just of those actively traded images, who are the offenders. And I would note that now we're up to 68%. Someone the child knows and trusts. Totally makes sense, because we're talking about young kids, and who has access to young kids? People they know and trust, people in their family, people who are relatives, people who have trust of the family. So, you know, what I really just want to emphasize is that hopefully this is really validating and ringing bells and lining up with what we know about child sexual abuse prevention. And it really is true of the images we see online as well. So before we drop off, I want to just spend a few minutes going through some of the resources that we have. Again, I don't have time to go into these in super depth, so I hope that you'll spend some time exploring our website and reach out to me if you have questions. But I want to highlight 2 things. One is this button I've circled here that says, is your explicit content out there? And the other one is exploitation resources. So exploitation resources are things, it's information you can actually, if you have someone in your community, someone you work with, someone who comes through your CAC who has an image that's circulating, is worried about that, these are resources specific for those survivors and specific to professionals who are serving them. So I mentioned already this notion of someone who's been sexually abused, and then is not only dealing with their sexual abuse history and healing from that, but they are dealing with an ongoing trauma of people seeing their imagery every day. And what is that like? And what is it like to feel like you might be recognized in public and someone right now is viewing your images or using your images to groom a child to abuse them? It's a really heavy burden, and it's a really specific therapeutic needs that those kids have. And so we have lots of resources, and you can also pick up the phone and talk to our family advocacy division specialists as well. But I want to make sure you know about that website. Again, as we're seeing potential for climbing of online exploitation, making sure professionals are ready and communities are ready. The other website I want to talk about is this, is your explicit content out there? So the message we really want to give communities and kids is that if you know of some explicit content of you, it could have been something that you sent or made, or it could have been abuse that you suffered that you think was recorded and distributed, you can get it down And you can go to our website, and you can see the platforms across the top, direct instructions on how you contact and how you work through each platform about getting that imagery down, even if it's not on your account, for example. But if it depicts you as a minor, you have recourse to go and help get it down. And this goes platform by platform. But you can also, let's say you don't want to deal with that, or you've tried to deal with it and you feel like you're not getting a response, or you're not sure if they're responding to your request, you can actually call us. And we have people who work at the National Center, we call them the takedown team. It's my favorite. And their job is to liaise with these platforms and to help get explicit content down, even content where it may not meet the legal definition of child pornography, but you know, the child or the victim knows that it is associated with exploitive content, or something like that. They can work with these platforms. And you can see from the graph here, what we tried to show is this service is getting increasingly used, but we're getting faster at getting imagery down. So we're often successful in getting imagery off of platforms in about 24 hours, which is really good for trying to stop that imagery from getting into that tornado of active circulation. So we really want kids to hear that even if this is something, even if you talk to someone online you shouldn't have talked to, or they told you to send a picture and you shouldn't have, or you were uncomfortable, you did it anyway, we don't want you to keep that a secret. We want you to talk to a trusted adult about it. We want that trusted adult to be equipped to know to report to the cyber tip line and contact and report it to the platform, and if needed to contact us to help get it down, because we want to get that imagery back down and prevent that re-victimization of circulation as much as we can. So with my last few minutes, I'm going to just talk a little bit about Stacy already gave a shout out for our prevention resources. Our internet safety program is called NetSmarts. It's been around, we think it might be the first internet safety program around since about 2001, about to celebrate our 20-year anniversary. But if you go to our website, and if you haven't been in a while, it's been newly updated. There's some new material really for parents and kids to go through together and talk about safe choices online, talk about risks online, but really build those skills as well for kids to be able to make good choices, and for parents to get knowledgeable about how they can support and protect their kids. On the website, you know, we have presentations that are ready to go that, you know, have presenter notes and explain how you can present to adults as well as kids in middle, high school, and elementary school. We have shorter videos and tip sheets and games and all sorts of things that you can use in your local communities. And you'll see on the right side of your screen, Into the Cloud is our newest web series specifically for elementary school. We made a decision to really focus on that age group, both because we know from our data that young kids, as I mentioned before, can be at risk for being exploited online, and we don't tend to talk about online safety to young kids. Sometimes we don't realize that we need to. And we also struggle with how do you talk about sextortion or online enticement or all these heavy topics with young kids in an appropriate way that's not scary, but is empowering. And so we've tried to do that with Into the Cloud. It's specifically for elementary school students, and the videos and discussion guides, one-on-one discussion guides. They're great even for parents, just to sit down and say, what do you do online? Let's look at your privacy settings. Let's talk about what happened in the video. You know, what do you think we should do with this app, or how should we set this one up? And then also my favorite tip sheet I think that we have that's featured on the left there is called So You Sent a Sext, which gets into what I was just talking about helping kids realize that there is, you know, we used to say once it's out there, it's out there. There's nothing you can do to take it back. That's not always true anymore. There's better technology to get it down. And so we don't want you to just sit there and think that it's over. We want you to report it and work with you to get it down. So we've got lots of information about that on that tip sheet as well, and lots of other stuff you can find. So I think I ended a minute earlier, but I'll go ahead. I saw lots of flickers in the chat box, so I'll go ahead and stop there and take some questions, I think.
Yes. Hi, Susan. So we are, with the time that we have left, we are going to, I'm trying to get this to work. We're going to ask you some questions that we got both when people registered and during the presentation. So, all right. So we have a ton of questions. Just to start, this seems very overwhelming to us. If I'm a teacher or a child advocacy center, where do I start to educate parents or educate professionals?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of it, gosh, that's a good question. I think some of it is doing kind of a little bit about what I did here and getting people a little bit more comfortable. This isn't something totally separate that you have to learn. This is actually very similar to everything we teach kids about safety, and making good choices, and thinking about the access and exposure that our kids have. So, thinking about, am I aware of every way? I have kids, I have young kids. I have a 7-year-old who's just starting to kind of get into gaming. Do I know every way he can be contacted on that platform? And have I equipped him with what to do and what to watch for? So he's very good already at, asking me before he jumps off to a new website or something, or any kind of talking online to people. So I think it's really demystifying it. This isn't a whole separate thing. This is something that you and I do. We are on social media. We are on live streams. It is just about sitting down and talking to your child about what they do online and understanding it. And again, with that frame of access in your mind, what are the ways in which my child is able to access and broadcast to the world? And what are the ways in which people are able to contact him or her? And have I done everything I can to understand and put privacy and controls in when I need to, and equip my child with information as well for, what to do and what to watch out for.
And I love that message, especially now with all of us being mostly remote and the potential of virtual school coming up, or continuing, because we got a lot of questions about that during e-learning. What strategies can schools use to help protect kids with the increased exposure and increased time online? I got an interesting question about faculty in higher education who teach dual enrollment or early college. And, because a lot of times we think of those students as college age, but they're really high school kids. So any differences in what you would teach the higher education faculty to do versus elementary, middle, or high school?
Yeah, I mean, I think with, that's a tricky age group, because when you're doing dual enrollment, you're working with probably 16, 17-year-olds as well as 18 and 19-year-olds. And I think cognitively and developmentally, there's a lot of similarities across that spread. I think part of what I would do is just be very honest with those kids that there's a legal difference in those age groups, and that, what you do online and, choices that you make, it's really, part of what you do have to think about is we have 17-year-olds in this class, and they need to be, cognizant of that. And I don't know, I don't know. I would kind of have to think about that. That's a pretty unique question, but I think part of it is being honest with kids. I think a big thing that we are guilty of sometimes as adults is not being honest with kids about what their lived experience is. And when we walk into a room and we say, if you send a sext, it will 100% be circulated online. You will definitely be abducted and end up in a basement. I don't mean to be funny, but I do think that's the way adults approach this, because we're so uncomfortable. Because for most of us, we did not have our first early relationships when we were young, impulsive teenagers with a camera in our pocket. We just didn't. And that's their lived experience. So I think it's really important to validate lived experiences, both because that's just a respectful thing to do, but also because it builds credibility. I think you lose all credibility if you kind of walk in. Again, the sexting thing is a whole different conversation, but I think with that age group, part of it is just being really open and honest with people that, whatever you think of it, 17-year-old and 18-year-old, there are different rules and laws, and you can get yourself into a lot of trouble.
Yeah. And so we hear a lot from educators right now about during COVID how, we're hearing that abuse rates are increasing, but reports are decreasing. And so what is the message that we need to be sending to educators about checking on kids, or if they're having one-on-one interactions with kids online, or how can kids report? Do you have any tips for educators during this kind of tricky time?
It's very hard. And we know that, the kids that we're most worried about are ones that our teachers aren't going to be able to get in touch with, right? I mean, that's the reality. So it's a really hard question. I do think, again, in putting that lens back on online exploitation and child abuse, kind of being in the same bucket, all the things we would have you watch out for: behavior changes, certainly, kids who seem depressed, kids who seem very different than when you saw them before, any kinds of signals that they're giving to you, or things that they're saying to you about unsafe school environments. I mean, I think you ask questions about that the same way you would if they were in your classroom, and make reports when you feel it's warranted. I don't know that there's, a lot of difference. Again, like a lot of the exploitation is kids being abused in their home and then it's filmed. So you're going to find that the same way you're finding it if you're able to discover information to report about sexual abuse.
Right.
I would say it's a good idea to ask kids, just as I'm always a proponent. I mean, as a former forensic interviewer, I'm very comfortable asking direct questions. And I feel like there's a time and a place for those. And I think that applies for online as well. You know, like you guys have been online a lot. How's that going? What did you enjoy? What did you find online? What are you doing online? That's really cool. And then asking, was there anything that you found online or anything that happened to you online that was upsetting, uncomfortable, scary, not okay, whatever your word is there. But I think the key is that, we should ask direct questions about kids' online life, because I also think kids tend to perceive that adults don't want to be involved in their online life. And that is the opposite of what we want them to think. We want them to think we care about what they're doing online, that they should expect our involvement and our monitoring as is age appropriate, and that we want to know about it. We're comfortable talking about it. So when we're asking about peer relationships, online and offline, and you guys at the Monique Boyer Foundation know bullying and cyberbullying are not separate things. They happen in real life, and a lot of times there's carryover. So I think the biggest thing is to really infuse those questions that are directly asking about online. So, not just asking, did anything scary happen to you while you're at home? How are you doing? We can also ask about online lives as well. I think that's important.
Yeah. And I love your message about it's not one particular app that we have to be concerned about. And so the conversations are super important. Along with that, are there any kind of monitoring apps for parents that NCMEC recommends that parents can use to help them in that effort?
Yeah, so we don't endorse or recommend a specific monitoring software. And so we don't have a specific one. I think what our main message is that those things can be really helpful. And, depending on your kid and your situation and their history and their vulnerabilities and all that, it may become really important. I don't have a endorsement of a particular one or a type, but we always tell parents, no matter what kind of monitoring software you have, it doesn't take the place of these conversations like you were just saying, because the reality is, COVID's a little tricky, but in general, kids know how to get around everything, and, they'll go to a friend's house and hop on the internet and talk to the person you don't want them talking to there. Or like, that's why we say there's no bad apps. If they're really motivated or really, stuck in this relationship or being manipulated or whatever it is, they'll get a friend to send the handle of another site, and then they'll just move over there. Offenders move platforms all the time. That's the other reality. So we don't have a specific monitoring software that we recommend.
So someone asked, any thoughts on how the growing amount of younger children that are being sexualized through social media, how do we stop that? How do we counter that, change that trend?
I have a lot of thoughts about that. I think that's a great observation, because I do think, and when you look at sort of broader child abuse prevention strategies, and I know Stacey and I are both members of the National Coalition to Prevent Child Sexual Abuse and Exploitation, it talks a lot about what we need to do at a societal level. And part of that is to look at demand, and end demand is how we put it in the national plan. But yeah, you're right. There's this insidious sexualization of children, where kids are getting this message that it is good and it is what people, expect of you to put really sexualized content online. And a lot of it's not exploitive, but it is adding to the sexualization and demand for young children as sexual objects. That goes far beyond my role at NCMEC. I'll just be totally honest. I have lots of human opinions about that, but it is definitely something, at NCMEC, we understand more, probably than anyone, what a tremendous amount of demand there is for this material. And it's a huge problem. And I think our kids are getting tremendously harmful mixed messages about sexualization in young kids. And I think that's super important to bring in this conversation.
Yeah, and our speaker last week, Richard Gary from IROC too, talked about what you were talking about, the self-produced explicit imagery, and how now sites like Snapchat and other sites, they have premium where people can put their own content and it's monetized. They can make money doing that. And so it's a really hard place that we're in. And I think, coming from the MBF perspective, and I know from NCMEC as well, that's why we are such proponents of prevention education from a very young age, because I think we're trying to counter the messaging that kids are getting about being sexualized and how great that is and how much sex sells. And so, yeah. So let's see, I think we have just a couple more minutes. Age appropriate education without premature exposure. So talking about starting young, how young do we start?
Yeah, so that's hard. So I think we need to separate talking to kids about sex and sexuality and sexual abuse from talking to kids about their bodies. So I think that's the first thing. So I think, again, thinking more broadly about child sexual abuse prevention, You know, it's certainly something in the field we've been talking about. I mean, toddlers should know the names, the anatomically correct names for their body parts. And that doesn't mean that we're talking about to them about sex at 2 years old, but we are talking to them about what the names for their body parts are. And what we found is that that's extremely protective from child sexual abuse, because it empowers kids to own and assert boundaries over their whole body, but it also serves as a signal to would-be offenders that this is a kid who knows about their body, who has adults in their life who are comfortable asking questions about that part of their body. And so they're not going to make a good victim, because they're going to be a kid who's probably going to talk about it. And I would say, so that's part of it, is like we worry about exposing our kids to sex, but we need to separate that from exposing them to information about their bodies. And that can really start pretty young. As far as this online stuff, I mean, it's something we've actively been thinking about at NCMEC, because season 2 of Into the Cloud is actually going to talk about sextortion. And our goal is to talk about that topic to as young as kindergartners. And we've really struggled with how do you do that? But when you see in the data that even 5 years ago, we know kids as young as 8 were victims of sextortion, you don't have a choice but to equip kids with, you know, and I think it could be as simple as this. You know, I talk about how I was a forensic interviewer. So my kids knew, you know, I have a son and a daughter, and as soon as my daughter was born, everybody knew all the names for the body parts, right? Because we had a little infant in our home. And I never used cutesy names, because that's not what I would do as a professional. But until I came to NCMEC, I never talked to my kids about videos. I never talked to my kids about how they shouldn't have their body parts exposed on camera. It never occurred to me. And it's that the fact that they don't have that information. They take a picture of everything. Why? I mean, naked, and especially pre-modesty, bodies are hilarious, you know? So we're not equipping them with information they need to say like, hey, actually, it isn't okay for me to show you my private part and send you a picture of it. How would they know? How would they know at 4 or 5 if we're not telling them?
Right.
So pretty simple things, like I give the example of, you know, one of my kids wanted to FaceTime with my mom, with grandma, and then the other kid is in the bathtub, like, I want to talk to her, and just taking a moment to say, you know what, you don't have any clothes on, so it's not an appropriate time to be on video with anybody.
Right. Using those opportunities.
And the difference is I'm not going beyond to saying, and I'm telling you this 4-year-old because I'm worried somebody's going to sexually exploit you. You don't have to go down that road, even though in your head you're going down that road. What you're doing is giving them age appropriate information and boundaries. But you can tell them this is not something that, just as we don't show our private parts in public, the internet is public. And it comes up a lot. I don't know if other working parents feel this, but I have this all the time. Now that I'm on Zooms, we have to talk about what you're wearing if you're going to stand behind me, you know, because my kids are little and sometimes they're not fully dressed, and I don't care in my home, and you can have whatever boundaries you want in your home. But, you know, if you're in your underwear, you need to stay off camera. And how often we're not really having those conversations with our kids. So I think a lot of what this is bringing in, you know, giving kids control of their bodies, and boundaries and age appropriate information about their bodies and relationships, and not sweating so much and freaking out about telling them about sex when they're too young. And people can have different opinions about that. But.
Well, and I think too, you can have those conversations in a very age appropriate way. I know we use the term for kids K through 2, abuse to your body. So we can get the same concepts across to them in a very age appropriate way without even using the word sex. So that makes a lot of parents more comfortable. So just a couple more questions for you, and we're about to end, but specific to NCMEC. Somebody asked for resources for parents with low incomes, and NCMEC's resources are all free, correct?
Yes. Everything on our website is free. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's fabulous. And then somebody, last question, they asked how successful the takedown team is in getting images and videos removed from platforms that are hostile or otherwise knowingly hosting illegal content.
Yeah, so I don't have a platform by platform breakdown of that. I mean, I think in general, our sense is, you know, we work cooperatively with the tech industry, forming these, and again, many of them go above and beyond and partner with us on involuntary, voluntary initiatives. There are some that's not voluntary, but some of it is. And, you know, for us, sometimes because we know the trust and safety people, and we're very well versed in the legalities and the capabilities, that we're just more, you know, can be really efficient in taking it down. I don't have a platform by platform breakdown to know what platforms you're asking about. So I don't have that today.
So we are about out of time. And as we end today, first of all, thank you so much, Susan. What a great presentation to kind of get us all up to speed. You know, it feels like it changes almost daily sometimes what we're dealing with online. So it was great to hear from NCMEC because you guys are the ones seeing it. So you're better equipped to educate us. I know there were a lot of questions we probably didn't get to, and there's an email address on the screen, outreach@ncmec.org, that you can send any specific emails to, and Susan and her team will be happy to get back to you. We also talked about maybe posting some answers to questions with our resources. You will get a follow-up email within 24 hours. Sometimes it takes these recorded webinars a while to process, but once we get it, we will send you an email with the recorded webinar, with a certificate of completion that you can print out, and with a link to a page with a bunch of resources that Susan shared with us for NCMEC. You can go directly to their website. You can go to our website. So you should get that within 24 hours. But we just want to thank you so much for being here and for sharing all of your knowledge. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you again, Susan, for being here. I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your day, wherever you are, what time you have left, and hopefully we'll see you again next week.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Everybody.
Thank you all.